Good evening, everyone, and thank you all for joining us tonight on this beautiful night when you could be at Crimmer's Field looking for the first geese who apparently did get the memo that spring is late to the interior, but we're really glad you're here. My name is Lynn Snifka. I teach in the Department of Science and Environmental Journalism here at UAF, and I am going to moderate tonight's discussion. And what I'd like to do is start off just by introducing our panelists. Immediately to my right is Paula Dobbin. She is our Snedden Chair in journalism for the department. She's also a journalist with decades, she wouldn't let me say how many decades of experience in print, broadcast, and multimedia journalism. And to Paula's right is Colin Warren. He is the incoming editor-in-chief of UAF student newspaper, The Sun Star. He also was recently awarded a student writing fellowship with the Nation magazine. So happy to meet you. Next is Gary Black, who is the managing editor of the Fairbanks Daily News Miner, where he is responsible for overseeing news coverage for the second largest daily newspaper in the state and the oldest continually operating paper in the state.
It's nerve-wracking when you say it.
No.
It is.
To Gary's right, we have Carol Gray, our Constitution expert. She's an attorney and also an assistant professor of public law in the political science department at UAF. And finally, last but certainly not least, on the end, we have Dermot Cole, who writes a popular news accountability blog reporting from Alaska. He's been a columnist in Alaska for more than 40 years. And of course, he is the author of several books, including Fairbanks, a Gold Rush Town That Beat the Odds. I said that correctly, right? All right. So why don't we start out tonight, Paula? Why don't you give us a little overview about where we are, journalistically speaking?
Okay, well, thank you all for coming out. It's great to see everybody here. It's very interesting times that we're living in, as you all know. There's lots of events going on in Washington, D.C., and there's just no shortage of news happening on a day-to-day basis. As a longtime journalist, I've been watching the situation closely, as I have for a long time, but I feel like since the inauguration, things have kind of really picked up in terms of the relationship between the White House and the press. And you know, as far as freedom of speech, which, as you all know, is protected by our First Amendment, there have been a few troubling developments. There's also some bright spots. So I'll just start off by giving you a few examples. So how many people here have heard of the Associated Press? Okay, great. So as you know, the Associated Press is this global news organization that's based in the United States, but they have bureaus all over the country and all over the world. And in February, they were barred from going into the Oval Office, and they were barred from going into or on Air Force One and the East Room. And so, when I heard that, I was like, wait, that can't be. Like, that cannot be. Why would the AP be barred from covering the White House? And the rationale from the administration is that the news agency is not going along with the change of the name of that body of water between Florida and Mexico, which is called the Gulf of Mexico.
Or America.
Yeah, so as you know, the administration changed the name to the Gulf of America. The AP, because it's a global news organization, stuck with how the Gulf had been called, for many decades. And they said, we're not going to go along with the change of calling it the Gulf of America, because we have clients all over the world. And, all these other foreign governments are not calling it the Gulf of America. So we're going to stick with our editorial policy of calling it the Gulf of Mexico, while also putting in a disclaimer that the name has been changed. So anytime you see the AP referring to the Gulf of Mexico, they always say, but the name has been changed by the administration or some other words to that effect. Anyway, the fact that they were barred from the White House resulted in a lawsuit. They pushed back against this. They said that this is a clear violation of our First Amendment rights, to the free press. And so, it's been in court now for a few weeks, but today there was a ruling in the case. And the federal judge sided with the AP and basically said that the decision to bar them from the White House was unconstitutional. And Carol will speak more to like why the judge ruled that way. I'm not an attorney, so I'm not even going to go anywhere close to that. But anyway, so that's one development that has been really interesting to watch. Another one, there's been a series of lawsuits. For example, the White House, went after CBS News for this interview that was aired on the 60 Minutes program, which is like this, really popular, long-time investigatory hour-long news show that's on Sunday nights. And the White House basically claimed that the producers.
Fall that it was on, right?
I'm not
Yes.
sure the exact air date, but anyway, it was when Kamala Harris was competing with President Trump or candidate Trump at that point to try to become our next president. Anyhow, the objection was that, or the allegation was that the interview was edited in such a way to make Kamala Harris look good, and that they should have, not done that. That was an error on their part. So 60 Minutes and CBS said, no, that's not the case. Like, it's always within our purview to edit, interviews for length and for clarity and things like that. And this was a $20 billion lawsuit that they were facing. So they were trying to like work it out. Like, how are we going to like deal with this? Some people were saying like, don't go along with what the White House is saying. Others were saying, well, just come to a settlement, like do something to make this go away. And so basically, while the case is still ongoing, CBS did agree to turn over the full transcript of the interview and the raw footage of the interview. So some people saw that as a capitulation, and other people said, well, this is the reality. Like, a lot of media organizations now feel intimidated by the White House. And so, they're calling it anticipatory acquiescence. Like, just go along with it, like make this go away. Anyway, that case is now being mediated. But preceding that one was another lawsuit by President Trump when this was before he took office in January. This was, I think, in March of last year. He sued ABC News because George Stephanopoulos, their longtime anchor, made a mistake on air. He said that a court in New York had convicted Trump of raping the writer E. Jean Carroll. In fact, what the jury found was he was liable for sexual abuse of Miss Carroll. And in New York, there is a difference between the crime of rape and the crime of sexual abuse. So George Stephanopoulos did make an error, but it's kind of unusual for, a powerful personality or, somebody who's been a former president to like sue over something like that. It seems a little bit emblematic of the ongoing relationship. But anyway, ABC did pay $15 million to settle this lawsuit. And they also wrote a note of regret for the error. So that was like, a lot of people in the journalism world were like, this is mind blowing. I cannot believe that ABC would do this. But again, it's kind of like, to what extent do you want to fight back versus just making it go away? Okay. Since then, since President Trump has taken office again, he's done other things like, he's appointed an FCC commissioner who is trying to defund NPR and PBS, these two public radio or public broadcasting entities. There's been other examples of like the White House Correspondents Association, which had traditionally decided which media outlets would go into the press pool to cover the White House. Because in a lot of White House events, like not all the hordes of media can get in. Like, you have to limit access because the physical space is small. So you have a pool, and you might have, a print reporter, a photographer, a radio person. It's just kind of a selection, and then they gather the news and then they share it with the other entities in the news media. And traditionally, the White House Correspondents Association was the entity that selected who would go in the pool, and it was kind of a rotating, cast of characters who could do this. Well, recently, the press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, said, well, we're going to not have the White House Correspondents Association do that anymore. We'll do it. So the White House will decide which media get in to cover the president in the pool. And this kind of was just a norm-breaking decision. And one that a lot of journalists felt like, why should the White House be deciding which journalists get to go in the pool? Like that should be our professional, decision. So anyway, that was something that ruffled a lot of feathers. Right after taking office, President Trump also sued the Des Moines Register and this pollster who had done a poll that showed that Kamala Harris was ahead. And he claimed that that was like a false poll. And so that's one more example. There's many others. I won't continue to go on. But the point being that there's just been a lot of, hostility and, name calling. Like you frequently hear the president calling the AP and other mainstream journalists like left-wing radical lunatics, scumbags, corrupt. He gave a speech at the Justice Department not that long ago where he accused CNN and MSNBC of being political operatives and that their reporting should be considered illegal. So, the level of rhetoric is really high. And this isn't to say that other presidents haven't done similar things. It's just a different style. Like under the Obama administration, Obama subpoenaed journalists. He dragged journalists into court. He was trying to like root out the leakers and stuff like that. So, and of course, this also happened during the Nixon administration. The Nixon administration tried to stop the Washington Post and the New York Times from publishing the Pentagon Papers. So it's not like President Trump is, he's the only person that's ever had a hostile relationship with the press. But it does seem like it's kind of on steroids right now, and the level of rhetoric is super hot. And so it'll be interesting to hear what the other panelists have to say about what's unfolding. So that's pretty much what I have to say about it.
Well, thanks, Paula. Now, Carol, I'm going to call on you. Can you give us an overview of how the First Amendment of the Constitution factors into this relationship between the press and the government?
Yes, I'll be happy to. So, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. We all know what that is. It's the First Amendment. Interestingly, on January 20th, this year, there was an executive order that touched on freedom of speech by the Trump administration. Part of it, and I quote, says, under the guise of combating misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation, the federal government infringed, she's talking about the prior administration, infringed on the constitutionality protecting speech rights of American citizens across the United States in a manner that advanced the government's preferred narrative about significant matters of public debate. Government censorship of speech is intolerable in a free society. I agree with President Trump. He goes on in this executive order to say that part of the order requires that ensure that no taxpayer resources are used to engage in or facilitate any conduct that would unconstitutionally abridge the free speech of any American citizen. This is all in the executive order. Section 3 says ending censorship of protected speech. No federal department, agency, entity, officer, employee, or agent may act or use any federal resources in a manner contrary with the previous section. So it goes on, and I'd now like to talk about infringements of freedom of speech under the Trump administration. To give context, by the way, I will recommend National Public Radio has an excellent series out just this week on the First Amendment. And it's wonderful. It's about 8 to 10 minutes every morning, and it's the state of the First Amendment. I've listened to the first 2 episodes. They're excellent. And actually a number of my ideas are pulled from there. So I'll give credit where it's due. And they mentioned that freedom of speech is often protected or a concern of those who've had their freedom of speech censored and or limited. And Trump, as we know, was banned on Twitter. So this is a particular concern of his. He was banned on Twitter because of his false claims that he won the election against Biden. After he won the most recent election, which he did win, his billionaires who control social media, Mark Zuckerberg of Meta, formerly Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp, who's the world's richest social media entrepreneur with a personal net wealth of 117 billion. He said that Meta would no longer be tracking truth and fact checking. So this is right in the wake of what is going to be an onslaught of information that might not be accurate. And Elon Musk, as you know, net worth of 362 billion, now controlling X. So we have a lot of the social media networks controlled by people who are the same narrative as President Trump. Meanwhile, Trump has passed more than 100 executive orders. That's more than double what any president has ever passed in history, and that's only in the first 77 days. What have some of his orders included? Well, thousands of web pages from the government have been taken down. They include topics related to diversity, vaccines, hate crimes. The Smithsonian museums are at risk of being censored with exhibits taken down because they don't portray America in a positive light. The Kennedy Center has had their board taken over by President Trump. And some artists have, the Kennedy Center is one of the most, in Washington, D.C., it's a theater, forum, ballet for all sorts of artists, and various artists are refusing to perform there because Trump has taken over their entire board. The Defense Secretary, Pete Hegseth, his office ordered the removal of almost 400 books from the U.S. Naval Academy's library. This just happened this week. Books include Maya Angelou's I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, Memorializing the Holocaust, Half American, a book about African Americans in World War II, Respectable Woman, about roles women played in the public arena in New York in the 1800s, Pursuing Trayvon Martin, about the 2012 shooting of the 17-year-old Black man in Florida. At the same time, detentions and attempts to deport foreign students for exercising their freedom of speech has been unlike any other time in my lifetime. At least 300 students have had their visas revoked because they have written op-eds. They've participated in demonstrations, all things that are protected by the First Amendment. By the way, when I read the First Amendment, you said it says Congress shall make no law, and then it goes on to say the right of the people to peaceably assemble. Does it say citizens? No. Does it say anything about immigrants better behave because they're going to get punished while everyone else has First Amendment rights? No. So the First Amendment applies with equal force to anyone who is in this country. It doesn't matter if you're an immigrant. I did hear one of the commentators on a podcast said they might be within their rights to not grant visas because they don't like someone's track record in their home country. But once the visa is granted, it should not be revoked as retaliation for exercising your First Amendment rights. It's not legal. And these detentions, they're not just pulling the visas to these students. You probably heard about the doctoral student from Tufts University. She was walking on the street and she's grabbed by masked men, not in uniform, and she screams, and she's a former Fulbright scholar. What was her crime, if you call it that? She co-authored an op-ed saying that Israel with a death toll of now more than 50,000 in Gaza was guilty of genocide. And by the way, the International Court of Justice is listening to a court case on that very issue, that is Israel guilty of genocide? Certainly, in my view, war crimes, when you could kill more than 50,000, many of whom are civilians, that qualifies as war crimes under the Geneva Convention. But let me go on with a list of Trump administration actions. So changing the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America, Denali changed to McKinley or Mountain, attacks on law firms bringing suits against the Trump administration. This is unprecedented. They're targeting law firms, saying they will pull the security clearance of law firms, who many of them these huge law firms, they're international in nature. They represent clients who need security, need them to have security clearance to be able to represent them adequately. To threaten to weaponize security clearance, this is unprecedented. To weaponize federal funds to universities. So I will say that some universities have fought back against the Dear Colleague letter that said that universities should remove all language related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Sadly, UAF did not fight back, and it just removed all the language. And this weaponizing of federal funding is also unprecedented. It directly targets speech. Political speech is the core speech that has the greatest protection of the Constitution. There's also attacks against judges. One judge that ruled against President Trump said he should be impeached. Well, Chief Justice John Roberts, in an unprecedented response, the Supreme Court generally doesn't respond to politics at all. They keep out of the fray. Well, he said that is not acceptable. You do not threaten to impeach judges just because they rule against you. Thankfully, there hasn't been another suggestion of that. I think listen to Chief Justice Roberts. As we heard, the AP was kicked out of their offices in the Pentagon. There were attempts to withdraw funding from NPR and PBS and revoke their licenses. And AP was not allowed to go to the Oval Office and Air Force One press conferences. Segue to law. So a case that did, Paula, by the way, thank you for hosting the panel, Paula. I forgot to say thank you. And anyway, just today, this case comes out, and I'll quote from the judge's order. So the judge said that the AP's request for an injunction to force the White House to reinstate them in the Oval Office and Air Force One press events, that injunction means White House, you have to do this. It's requiring somebody to do something. That's what injunction is. And the court said, the court simply holds that under the First Amendment, if the government opens its doors to some journalists, be it to the Oval Office, the East Room, or elsewhere, it cannot then shut those doors to other journalists because of their viewpoints. That's fundamental to the First Amendment. In terms of what the Supreme Court has said, the Supreme Court has held that in public debate, we will have robust speech, even if it is offensive, even if we don't agree with it, even if it advocates for hate or even overthrowing of the government. If it doesn't actually take action to do those things, it's still protected speech. This podcast, the NPR commentator said, framers of the Constitution recognize that freedom of speech is a natural right that pre-existed a government. So it's fundamental to protect. I will also, I'm wrapping up, but I think that a lot of what's happening now reminds me of George Orwell's 1984, and also of history. So, for example, the Nazis removed un-German books from their libraries. Here's a quote from George Orwell: "If the freedom of speech is taken away, then dumb and silent we may be led like sheep to the slaughter." Here's a quote from Ronald Reagan: "Freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. We didn't pass it to our children in the bloodstream. It must be fought for, protected, and handed on for them to do the same." Last quote by, no, one more is a good one. Okay, George Orwell said, yeah, this is about the framing of history, the Smithsonian's. What books are we allowed to read? I have in my bag a stack of banned books I was going to put out for a visual aid. I'll show you later. George Orwell said, "Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past." And then one last one that you can think about it in the context of what's happening today. Again, George Orwell from 1984. "Every record has been destroyed or falsified. Every book rewritten. Every picture has been repainted. Every statue and street building has been renamed. Every date has been altered. And the process is continuing day by day and minute by minute. History has stopped. Nothing exists except an endless present in which the party is always right."
Thank you, Carol. A couple of quick announcements before we move on. The tables in the back, they do support, like, you can see there's a couple of people sitting on them. You can sit on them. And if there's nowhere to sit, we also have an overflow room. That's one floor down. It's room floor 12. If you're kind of stuck off to the side, there's a big video screen down there where you can watch it. And there's a couple empty chairs over here, apparently.
If there's an empty seat next to you, could you raise your hand?
All right, so apparently there's plenty of seats. And while folks are getting settled, I want to sort of bring this back to Alaska and how this all relates to our local media. So this is a question for our journalists. have the recent developments in Washington affected news coverage here at home, or how have they affected news coverage and what you guys are doing?
I'll jump, I'll go.
Okay.
There's so much that's happening so fast for a staff our size, we can't keep up. So we have to make a decision. Do we want to pursue this thing coming out of DC and how it's impacting Alaska and shove Mrs. Smith's garage sale to the side? We are a community newspaper that we try to balance this garage sale and pie bake off and her win at the, state fair for quilt making with an executive order that strips DEI references out of military bases,
Mhm.
So much happens so fast. For a staff of 6, I'm so proud of my team. They do great stuff, but it's nonstop. A few weeks ago, they came to me, all of them came to me in a group and said, we're tired.
Yeah.
So we're tired physically and mentally and emotionally. I said, I get it, so they're
You're
trying
doing
to
the
balance,
groundwork.
they're trying to balance life and having a life and then doing a great job at what they do. So definitely see that impact.
What about you, Colin? What's going on at the Sunstar?
Yeah, I'd say that we specifically are concerned about how this administration seems to be assaulting education at almost every level. Carol mentioned the Dear Colleague letter which asks the colleges and all schools to scrub DEI, which, Paula mentioned the phrase anticipatory acquiescence. I think that's I think that's what maybe some people took UA to do in their Board of Regents motion that scrubbed DEI, because they took that vote on a Friday, and that same Friday that Dear Colleague letter was held up in court in Maryland. And the Board of Regents met with Pat Pitney that next Monday and decided to go ahead with their endorsement of the scrubbing. So they thought about it and they decided to go along with it. And so it's our job to report on those things and to let people know what the UA system is doing to the whole organization here. And we see the assault coming in various levels. The New York Times reported today that so far the administration has in the last month has either repealed or suspended $3.3 billion in funding for higher education. And I think, we can't know what they're saying in those Board of Regents meetings because they kept that meeting closed when they talked with Pat Pitney that Monday. But we have to assume that they are worried about funding. And as I've been trying to understand what funding is being cut, a lot of scientists and other researchers are pretty scared to talk now because they're worried about their own funding getting cut. So it's hard to report on, and we're concerned about the effect it's going to have across our whole country and our educational system.
And I will back up what Colin says about trying to get people to talk who are scared. There are researchers here on campus that won't utter anything to the media for fear of retribution.
Yeah, and most of the stuff I'm hearing is from students who are losing their internships and losing their funding. Students who are either too naive or too brave to not talk.
What about you, Dermot? What's going on with what you're doing these days?
Well, first of all, mention about Colin. I was editor of Polar Star. I can't believe it was 49 years ago. I want to react to a few things that have been said about the ABC and CBS lawsuits. ABC is owned by Disney. CBS is owned by Paramount. Those conglomerates that own those news organizations caved and destroyed the integrity, to a degree, some of the integrity anyway, of the news organizations they own. Part of the problem of the ownership pattern of large organizations like that. Executive orders, we're getting that some of them are really important, like the one banning the use of paper straws. Now, I'm glad that the executive branch has enough time in order to do something. And to change the name of Fort Bragg, change it back to Fort Bragg, but after a different Bragg. It's no longer a a Civil War personage. It's a guy who got a Purple Heart during World War II. In the last few days, I found out these particular stories just since yesterday. On Friday, Senator Murkowski and another, one of her colleagues sent a letter about Ukrainian refugees in Alaska and other states who were given 7 days warning to get out of the United States.
Oh, no.
What? It was sent by mistake.
Oh.
This morning, I found out that a digitization grant held by the state library was canceled to digitize old newspapers, I think up to 1929, old Alaska newspaper. This afternoon, I learned about and this is maybe the most significant of these three. Today, the University of Alaska Anchorage received notice that the 10-year, 46 million ADAC Arctic Center of Excellence Award, as well as Scientific Leadership Award, has been terminated by the Department of Homeland Security. Now, this was a big grant that was, presented with much value within the past couple of years. I think we're being short. I mean, Alaska news organizations are really hurting. I mean, they are. I mean, the News Miner with 6 reporters.
Yeah.
At one time we had, when I was there, which was again a long time ago, I've been involved in the News Miner for 13 years. We had a newsroom staff of 30 and maybe 12 to 15 reporters. At good times, when the newspaper was making a lot of money. Newspapers used to be extremely profitable organization. They are no longer. And broadcast outlets are no longer that viable either. So it's what we face is a real problem of disinformation, which is spread very easily and very cheaply. And everybody who has a Facebook account is an expert. Just look. All you have to do is look. They know all about, name the topic. They don't even have to look at it. There's no need to read anything. There's no need to research. There's no need to know anything. Just, shout your expertise. Anyway, that's a real problem we're facing is disinformation. How this affects me personally, I just do whatever I want as a hobby. This is kind of my hobby. And I don't have a job and I don't want a job. I'm too old to have a job. So, I'm too old to be president. I'm 70, I'm gonna be 72 and that's too old. You don't need a 78-year-old president. We didn't need a president as old as Joe Biden either. But, and I'll just, one more thing. Tonight, President Trump gave a speech in which he said, among many other things, 2 hours more, spoke for 2 hours. I'm not gonna speak to this. But he spoke that how foreign leaders are kissing his ass, calling up and kissing his ass. Those are his words, not mine. Because they want to make a deal. Please, sir, please, we want to make a deal. And I don't think that's going to work. I don't think that's going to lead to factories being built across the United States. And I don't think it's going to lead to the construction of a $50 billion Alaska gas pipeline. Anyway.
With the spirit. Thank you. Thanks, Dermot.
And I just would like to say too, for challenges we're facing, specifically with student media, just an alert was announced just yesterday from student media organizations, and they have existed for over a century, and never before have they released this type of alert, suggesting that we reassess take back policies and anonymous source policies. And this speaks to the Tufts University student that was apprehended by plainclothes ICE agents on the street. So they're asking us to now reassess how we deliver news that goes against typical journalism protocol and at this moment in time, just because of what we're facing.
Then if I could just throw one, I read that opinion column that this student had her name on with several others. And it was not, it's not a great column, I don't think. From a legitimate point of view, a legitimate argument. Nothing world shaking, certainly nothing that's worth trying to punish you by kidnapping you. And terrible for the reputation of the United States.
And I think it's a great point that Carol brought up, that it's the people, it's not citizens that the First Amendment protects.
Very true. And Dermot, I'm really happy about your hobby. I like it hobby. I knit, not nearly as interesting. Well, this is supposed to be a conversation, so we're gonna open it up to questions. Well, I've got some more questions for our panelists later. A couple of quick ground rules. Please keep your questions as brief as possible. Sometimes people want to give a lot of backstory and we have a lot of people, so try to keep them brief. And also please speak as loudly as I'm speaking if you can, so our Zoom audience can hear you. And I think that's about it. And please be respectful to your fellow question askers and the panelists. Sir, you had a question.
Yes, Arthur Conothal, thanks for coming. Is journalism losing, maintaining, or advancing their influence?
Ooh, good question.
Yeah, repeat that?
He wanted to know if journalism was losing, advancing,
Losing,
maintaining, or advancing.
advancing their influence. Because this young man over here said that there's been motions to say to quiet down what you're doing because you don't want to lose funding and that type of sort. So you're all journalists, and how do you feel? Which direction are we going? Backwards, maintaining, or forward?
Well, I mean, I'll just jump in and say, it's certainly true what Dermot was saying, that the size of newsrooms in this country has shrunk dramatically. I used to work at the Anchorage Daily News, and we had probably about 150 people in that newsroom. And now there are maybe 12, like it's like a dramatic shrinkage. Okay, so the amount, simply the amount of coverage that these organizations can do has really ratcheted down. At the same time, you know, you've had the growth of podcasts and you've had the growth of citizen journalists. And there are, I will say that there are definitely some good citizen journalists out there. I mean, we found out about the murder of George Floyd because a young girl took video of it and it went viral. You know, there's other instances of how just regular people have shot video that has, you know, ignited revolutions and been a real cause for good in the world. But as Dermot also said, there's just so much noise out there. You know, it's like, it's hard for the average person to know like what is real news and what is fake news. And when you have an administration that characterizes any outlet who doesn't advance his agenda as fake news, it's just, I think it's just really hard for the average person to be media literate unless they really work at it. But that's partly why, like, I believe that we need to recruit more journalists into this industry because it's so necessary. I mean, we're charged with holding power to account, you know, and we learn about what's going on because of investigative journalism. I mean, that's our role. And so I just think it is kind of a sad time when you think about the downsides of the traditional media, but at the same time, you do have, you know, other voices, and some of those are good and they're legitimate, and others are just kind of wanting to create chaos, you know, and distort reality. So it's just a really dynamic environment right now. I don't know if anybody else wants to chime in.
Dermot.
Yeah, the one thing I would say is that a question like that has to be asked. And it is a good question. But one reason it has to be asked is because news organizations won't tell you that they don't have any reporters left. They don't advertise that.
Okay, that's not really true. I just said. Great job.
Gary, but on the pages of the formerly widest read newspaper in the United States, that's a joke. It used to be the widest. It used to be the widest paper.
Literally.
And anyway, but you know, the Anchorage Daily News is not promoting. Look, we only have a very small number of journalists, and anyway, and APRN doesn't do that either. But that's something they could do. But it's against their instincts because it strikes of people get the idea that they're failing. Well, I don't know. That's a dicey. Kind of that's the reality is that they are failing. That's the unfortunate reality.
I think,
Can I maybe just tell one more thing about citizen journalism? And I see Brian back there. Curtis Summer, who used to write, when the Newsminer had a very lively letter to the editor page, he wrote once a month from Canada complaining about the mistreatment of the Fairbanks Four, starting in about 1999 or so. Anyway, so Curtis was sort of a forerunner of this in terms of, he, and Brian will tell you that it was because of Curtis Summers haranguing that he got interested in that story.
He never missed one letter from.
And always, yeah.
he was very regular. Yeah. Carol, yeah.
So I just like to say that I think journalists are unsung heroes right now. And when I saw that this panel was offered and I get to sit with all the journalists, I'm like, yes, great, because if I weren't a lawyer or professor, I would want to be a journalist because they are just, it's so critical that we get accurate information. And it's a lot of work for us to keep up right now. And I would also urge all of us, don't check out. It's overwhelming, it's depressing, depending on your political perspective, but it's critical to stay informed. And even if it takes you double the amount of time, just carve that out, because if we're not informed, we really have no power to try to have this country be, respect rights and have enough infrastructure left in 4 years to carry on. I'd also say it's imperative that we contact our representatives about funding of the media. For example, NPR and PBS, the threats to cut their federal funding, that is a huge chunk of their budget. We should be calling our senators, our representative, and say, protect the funding of NPR and PBS. It's fundamental to have a free press, especially now. And so don't forget to contact your representatives, please.
Probably we're
I
gonna.
was just gonna add one more thing that about your question about are we growing or is it stable or what direction are we heading on? Like, yes, it's true that, in a lot of ways, the size of newsrooms are shrinking and the quote unquote legacy media, is in trouble. But there are all these really creative and interesting startup newsrooms. Like I just came from one of them in Hawaii. It's called Honolulu Civil Beat. It's been around for about 12 years now, but it's a model that is increasingly being recreated, where you have an independent business model. And in the case of Civil Beat, we were lucky. We had one of these tech billionaires, actually, the guy who started eBay. He basically funded Civil Beat entirely for the first few years, and then they increasingly got more donations and foundations to give money. But it's a nonprofit model. And, we've done I think, really good investigative journalism. Like we were finalists for the Pulitzer last year for our Maui fire coverage. And, there are many of these models that are popping up because people see like the traditional model of news has been dying because of the internet. Because it used to be that papers made their money through the classified ads. But as the internet grew and as Facebook and Google and all these other digital outlets took that money, people, instead of taking out the ad in the paper, they just did digital ads. That's made the whole model crumble. But as I said, there are more and more of these nonprofit models that are popping up to kind of fill the gap, and some of them are doing really innovative work. So that is a bright spot in the media landscape.
And I want to say, along with creative newsrooms, I think to go along with that, Italy a few years ago introduced to all their public schools required internet literacy. And we need to see that in our schools here, because younger people, they don't understand what they're getting is legitimate news or not, because they're seeing too much junk on all this social media, and it's impossible to suss through.
So all of that is sort of a way of answering your questions here with yes. Journalism is gaining, maintaining, and losing ground. It depends on
It's a dynamic landscape.
Yes, it's a dynamic landscape. We have a question from Zoom from Amanda. Is giving so much press time to the president giving him more power? Thinking about things like his saying he will have a third term. Will talking about it give it credence? Anyone want to take this one?
I'll just say it's completely unconstitutional for anyone to have a third. That's it.
Yeah, but
But the,
All right,
the
all right,
larger
but yeah,
question,
So
journalism.
one of the arguments that I've heard them say is, well, what if he was vice president and Vance were the candidate and he would actually pull the strings? And so it wouldn't be his third term, but actually even that is unconstitutional. There's an amendment that says you can't serve as vice president if you're not qualified to serve as president. So there is no way that he can serve a third term. But what is happening is by creating a dialogue, you're socializing people to think that things that are blatantly unconstitutional are somehow up for discussion. We should be insistent. The Constitution is required and nobody is above it.
So that is a great example, but for the journalists, do you wrestle with this? Is covering this sort of thing, making it real?
No, I'm going, no,
Okay.
you have to cover it. When the president says, I may run for a third term, and the Constitution says, no, you're not. That's something that needs to be out there. And you need to have a down the middle objective. This is what the Constitution says and why you can't do it conversation.
And then there were many stories about Trump mulls how he might try to qualify for a third term. Blessing it in a sense with that headline. I just was reading an interesting column today, and there, by the way, there are a vast number of really websites that have really good national reporting and regional reporting. Not so many in Alaska. Alaska is really, there's a handful of people that are really doing good stuff. But this guy was reflecting on the tariff issue, and he had talked to reporters who's raised the question of, what do you think is the policy? What policy advice is President Trump following here, and who are his advisors? And then his inclination is that, well, you're looking at it the wrong way. He doesn't have any. This is not policy advisors. This is not policy driven. This is an idea that Mr. Trump got in the 1980s. Has never let go of. This is his whim regarding tariffs. So in reporting that just looks at this as a matter of policy, it just sort of doesn't capture it. If you totally ignore Trump's talk about a third term, then that's a problem. If you give it immense coverage, that's a problem as well. I'm not sure how you balance it.
I do get sick of seeing Trump in the first 10 headlines of the New York Times every day. And I will say I was happy. I originally had Trump in the headline of my most read article this year, which was about the DEI in the border regions. And I pulled it out, and I'm glad I did.
Paul, you were gonna add something.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I mean, I agree with the argument to a certain extent that the media is over covering Trump, because I too get sick of waking up and, seeing the headlines and it's all Trump, 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 Trump. And I know that feeds into his ego. I mean, he loves that attention, he thrives on it. And so, I think a lot of media would prefer not to be covering him the way that they do, or to the extent that they do. But on the other hand, if the mainstream media isn't covering him and it's just the far right or the right media covering him, how is that going to serve the public? So I feel like we have a responsibility to cover him. And it's a balancing act, how much airtime do you give him? And unfortunately, he gets a lot of it because he's a master communicator. I mean, I'll give him that. I mean, he knows how to create headlines. He knows how to grab the attention of the world. And it's unfortunate that we're in that situation, that we have one person who's kind of driving the world news headlines day after day, multiple times a day. And I kind of feel like it's almost part of the strategy. It's like the shock and awe strategy that he's using with the executive orders and all these policies that keep coming out day after day. It's to overwhelm people so that they tune out. So while on the one hand, I would wish that the media wasn't covering him so closely, but on the other hand, we have to. I mean, that's the watchdog role of the press, is to hold power to account. And so, the more he goes after news organizations that are doing it, the more we need great lawyers to help us fight back. So it's kind of like this ongoing kind of tussle that is, I think it'll be really interesting to see what happens if he starts defying Supreme Court rulings. You know, that's when the S is gonna really hit the fan, I think. So
Very,
And also
very,
just,
go ahead.
sorry, just tagging on. So I agree with Paula that it's an effort to overwhelm the public. But also I think it's an effort to distract. So while we're watching every unconstitutional thing that he says, there are tax cuts for billionaires that are helping Elon Musk and people and having gonna save them billions. But what's it doing for everyday people? And what are we losing in the process? So it's like making all these shining objects that you look at and have to respond to, because, you know, when he says he needs a third term, you have to say something. But at the same time, if you ignore what's happening on the baseline of the economics that are, we have a country that's now more controlled by billionaires than it's ever been, I think, and certainly in the time I've been alive. And you have to look at also what is the role of the First Amendment and the free press when you have cases like the Supreme Court case, Citizens United, which said basically unlimited spending in campaigns. And so when corporations have First Amendment rights, and when people like Elon Musk in Wisconsin, he was paying people $100 per signature on a petition, which was basically like buying votes. There was an argument being made, this is buying votes, which is illegal, even though it technically wasn't a vote. But, you know, another silver lining, that Wisconsin election, which was to elect a justice to their Supreme Court, the woman who was running against the candidate supported by Elon Musk, she won. And not by a close margin, she thumped him. And this is after Elon Musk put $20 million into the campaign and wrote 2 checks for $1 million to people who were on his petition. So money doesn't necessarily mean you win.
And you wore a cheese hat too.
Let's take another question from the audience. I saw your hand first, ma'am.
Okay, so prior to the election, we saw a lot of nonsense coming from President Trump. And I heard the word sane washing because he's crazy, and newspapers tried to put it in some context we could read. And I remember reading it so often, I just thought, oh my God, comes the time, the Washington Post refused to endorse Harris. And I'm talking as a reader. I got so angry, I canceled my subscription. I thought I would be damned if I'm gonna pay you for being that way. So it's cutting my nose off in spite of my face because I need good news. Where am I gonna get it? I'm frustrated because is it the New York Times? They do some stupid stuff too. LA Times, they were just as bad. I started looking for newspapers that weren't owned by a person. So where are we? And now we've got who I think is a real hero is Jeffrey. Yeah, who now I want to give money to the Atlantic. So I guess I'm asking, what do we do as a readers when we feel like I trust, I rely, and here I am. Jeff Bezos says I can't know about something. I'm
So that's
curious
a
about it.
great question. How do we find sources that
But I do
are worthy of
get
trust?
the news miner every day.
Yeah.
All right.
And we are owned by a nonprofit corporation, not, it's got a vast,
Yeah.
nameless entity, not insurance.
And Paula,
The Washington Post is still one of the best newspapers in the country. It is also true that on the editorial page, the owner has injected himself and stifled opinion. Still have a lot of excellent reporters there though, and I mean, I understand people who say they cancel their subscription, but it's not sure what you replace
It's
it.
not helpful, is it, right? I just want to know, where do I go?
I mean, you
I
got,
know a lot of people say the same thing about New York Times.
you've got to curate, you know, you gotta have the New York Times still, you gotta have the Atlantic, you gotta have Substack, you gotta go outside the country and get Le Monde, you gotta go everywhere.
Yeah, exactly. All that costs something, right?
What I do-
Radio, PBS,
Of course.
Democracy Now! Has
Sure.
headlines 5 days a week for 10 minutes.
Wow.
But quickly, that eats up your working hours or your non-working hours, or not, I guess not working hours, because on the job.
And the New York Times Daily, the daily podcast.
Paula, were you gonna add something in?
Well, I was gonna say that, yeah, there are a lot of good free a lot of the major news outlets have free podcasts with roundups. So if you just want like a quick hit, you know, like the NPR news at the top and the bottom of the hour, that's only 6 minutes or 7 minutes long, and that's free. I personally subscribe to, the Anchorage Daily News, the Washington Post, the New York Times. I used to subscribe to the LA Times and the Guardian, but just for budget reasons, I had to knock a couple of those back. But I also subscribe to Apple News. So Apple News curates, good content from, a lot of different magazines, including The Atlantic and Rolling Stone and Mother Jones and Time Magazine and all the major news outlets. It costs $12.99 a month, but I find it really useful just to have Apple News.
And super interestingly, Apple is one of the only tech companies, they use people to curate their news. It's not done by computers, which a lot of them are.
You can also get the Apple plan where you get like the workout stuff and music and. But let's take another question.
Don't forget KUAC.
Are you in the back in the blue shirt, the Alaska shirt?
I'll preface it, this is not trying to be a setup, but in 2025, what is a journalist? And where is that line or border between a journalist and someone who is covering a story?
Great question. Anybody want, Paula?
Well, I mean, I would say that in the era that we're living in, there are people who pretend to be journalists for sure. They have no media training whatsoever and they're partisans. And they create their own blogs or they work for, these like fake news outlets. I forget, there's a name for them that I'm teaching this media and culture course right now. And there's actually we discussed this week and there's a name for these kind of fake news sites that, they're not satirical, they're made to look like real news sites, but it's all just partisan content, and stuff like that. So, I mean, I came up through, working on the job. I didn't study journalism, but I've had, many, many journalism jobs, and it's just, drilled into you from your editor or from your news director, that you present multiple sides to a story. Like you don't go in there with your opinion formed about this is the way it should be, or taking a side on something. I mean, you're trained to always present the facts as best you can from both sides or multiple sides. I mean, that's just a given. And then you keep your opinions out of it. But, we are in an era where kind of old school journalists like me, there's fewer of us, and there's more people who are content creators or, podcasters that are just mouthing off like what they think. And so you have to really discern like what is real news and what is opinion. And in the old days with the newspaper, it was very clearly delineated, like opinion page, editorial, and then that was separate from the news side. And now the lines are becoming increasingly blurred, and in some places, like, for example, the place that I just came from, the small nonprofit newsroom, we were in one room and we had the business people and the advertising people in the same room as the reporters. And in the old days, that would never have been the case. And literally the advertising people were on that side of the building and you were on a totally separate side. And there's a firewall, right? And that is blending now. Like it's kind of becoming a little bit more blended and less distinct. So it like I keep saying, it's kind of this evolving landscape, and I can see why the partisanship and the polarization in this country has gotten to the point it has, because everybody can just go into their own little ecosystem and listen to what they want to listen to and read what they want to listen to that aligns with their vision and keep out the other stuff. And it's kind of dangerous, frankly. I feel like,
It's more than kind of.
yeah, it's an understatement.
When you consume news that just reinforces your preconceived belief, that's not news. That's you're getting your information from a flack who shills for that party or that person or that individual. That's not news consumption. You are consuming a product that I like this because I agree, and that's a
And some
huge
of the
problem.
loudest voices in that are other podcasters. I mean, Joe Rogan, for example, is like the top rated podcaster. He has millions and millions of listeners. And, he influences many, many people's views on news and like what's reality. And
Does not post.
And he isn't fact checked.
I'm not sure that's a great thing. I mean, it's entertaining for sure.
Is it?
I mean, it could be, depending on your point of view. There's also a lot of, loud voices on the other side too, but they're partisans, so. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but.
Anybody else want to take a stab at that one? What? No.
There's plenty of questions.
No, absolutely not. Sir,
I'm curious where young people are getting their news these days. They're the leaders of the future, and Colin or any of you, you tell me where, if you can generalize, where UAF students.
all of my students get their news from social media.
Yeah.
Whatever.
That is
they
their-
rely on their screen.
That is their
What
number
TikTok
one
is.
source of news.
Any
Well,
particular
what about
apps?
these young people here? I
Guys,
mean, here?
let's-
TikTok and Instagram.
That's our staff up here and they're younger than me.
Yeah. Where do you guys get your news?
I think you were definitely correct on the social media part before I joined, being part of the new staff. I definitely didn't know anything about politics. I was in high school though, so granted, I didn't really need to. But, yeah, no, mainly just socials. I would say TikTok is the most misleading one that is used a lot because, anybody can post on it. You can post whatever. There's guidelines that don't really make sense. Like, I've had a video taken down that was showing mountains, but there's a comment that one time I reported because it was telling somebody to kill themselves, but they said that that comment was okay, but my video was not about mountains. So with the stuff going on there, the regulations aren't good. There's a lot of misinformation. People can say whatever. That's on all social media platforms, really.
Yeah.
But TikTok, in my opinion, tends to be the worst for news.
That tends to be where the most popular one for, and this is anecdotal evidence for me, but my students, it's like sort of number one TikTok, number two Instagram, Facebook is for old people.
Which we should know, we should know too, that TikTok was actually banned by Congress and that has been reneged by the administration right now. And just because the financial deal fell through because of the current tariffs, that's off the table. And so that's, just another case of law being flouted.
We're
Well,
gonna,
and the reason it was banned, I mean, whether that's a good reason, I don't know, but is the fear that China will use this social media platform to, cause problems for the United States and other nations, it's a good argument.
so you in the back with the glasses next to Brian. Or either one of you, sorry.
So back in 2016, an analysis of campaign donations showed that 96% of public campaign donations went to Hillary Clinton. In that environment, how can you realistically say that journalists are objective when covering Trump?
You're saying that, I'm sorry, 96% of journalists' donations went to him?
Were found to donate to Hillary Clinton, 4% donated to Donald Trump.
And what was the source for that?
The Center for Public Integrity.
The Center for Public Integrity.
Okay, assuming that's correct, that's not a survey of people covering the presidential candidates of that. Because most of them will not,
Journalists that even took part.
are not gonna do that. If your news organization is gonna ban it, you're not gonna be permitted to do that. At any legit organization.
I don't understand.
Can I just say,
I mean, as a reporter covering that issue, you're not.
Yeah, Carol.
you also have to look at, is it a statement of partisanship? Or is it, sorry, I'm just, or,
I think they're having their own.
oh, you're having, I was just answering your question. Sorry, hello? So I think. you have-
Brian's taking this
You,
one.
you have to look at, is it a statement of partisanship? Or is it a recognition that one of the candidates claimed to win an election that he didn't win? One of the candidates
This is
has,
In 16.
okay, oh, sorry,
So,
but, okay, so not against Trump, you're saying, I'm sorry.
No,
So
Trump
in
and Hillary.
2016, this
Okay, wait,
Center for
okay.
Public Integrity said that 96% of public donations
right.
went to Hillary Clinton.
Okay,
4%
But thank you for clarifying the date, but my point is still the same, that one candidate if you look at fact checking and the number of lies that come out per day, per week, et cetera.
Did Hillary Clinton's campaign not create a false dossier that was then used by the media in order to just?
Okay, the people covering the candidate are not gonna be making donations. Right?
Yeah, a journalist worth his salt is not
You-
making
you'll get fired.
donations. That's
You
the
you'll
end
get
of
fired for
story.
doing that if you're covering the candidate.
Let's move on to the
That, you're
next
talking about
question.
different subgroups here. So that's part of the problem with that question. It's difficult to, I can't really answer that, other than to point that out, that the coverage is done by people who are not doing what you said.
donating. I will say that when I was, and I think this is true for the majority of working journalists, whatever my sort of personal thoughts on any thing are, I've never had a yard sign. I've never donated to anybody. Because I don't want, even if I can be, completely objective in every single way, if somebody finds out that I put out a sign that Paula Dobbin for school board, I will be accused of writing biased things for her. It's sort of a difficult question to answer, but I'm gonna move on to another question. This is from Zoom, and this is a great question. It comes from Zachary Mason, our own Charles Mason's son. Yes, shout out to Zach. Given how Trump has weaponized the term fake news, how should journalists balance their ethical responsibility to seek the truth and combat misinformation with the reality that persistent aggressive pushback can feed into his narrative and further erode trust in the press among a significant portion of the public? And before we answer that that is a long question, but it is true. And
I think Charles should answer this
yeah,
question.
yeah.
Hey,
I mean,
I'm sitting over here.
In Gallup's latest poll, and this is from late last year, 31% of Americans express either a great deal or a fair amount of confidence in the media to report the news fairly and accurately. So how do these things all work together, and what do you do as journalists?
This is a
to
serious,
combat
it's a
that?
really serious problem. I don't really have an answer to it at all. I don't, even it does. I just want to read a quote from a history professor that I actually read this a couple days ago, and it's from Kristen Dumays, who's a history professor at Calvin University. This is her question. How do we, and it's the same as Zach's question, similar. How do we as citizens participate in a democracy when disinformation is so prevalent and when so many seem so willing to believe the lies and ignore the reality that is right in front of us? When so many are willing to abandon all values to choose their side every single time. So,
Well,
I think that is, we're not gonna get this trust back. I don't know how to do it. I don't think. It's-
Little by little.
No, it won't. I don't. It's gone. It's out. The genie's out of the bottle. And we can even put it into a real world context right here with a local issue. April 5th, there was a protest, one of the national protests in downtown Fairbanks. And a statewide blogger who's very conservative wrote that, oh, well, they all looked like tourists. They didn't look like anybody who was local. My source said they were all from out of town. The next thing you know, Fairbanks was full of paid protesters coming to the Golden Heart Plaza to protest from out of state, which is absolutely
Teaching
not
tourists
true.
how to dress really well.
Yeah. We had a local borough assemblywoman who picked that up and repeated on her Facebook page, which led to scads of local comments about all these paid protesters coming to Fairbanks, to which we reported. Commenters said this: no, there were no paid protesters. If you share it and you believe it, it just reinforces that belief, which goes back to stay off social media.
I just think that it just goes to the need for supporting more legitimate, middle of the road, nonpartisan news outlets. Because I think one of the most amazing examples of misinformation leading to like dire consequences just happened a few days ago when the president fired the head of the National Security Agency, a 4-star general, And that followed on the heels of I mean, I think everybody can agree that Laura Loomer is a conspiracy theorist. Like, and she had a meeting with the president about her concerns about certain people who are working for him, like not being loyal enough. I mean, she's widely recognized as a conspiracy theorist. Within hours of that meeting, he fired this four-star general. So I just think that in that kind of context, there's just such a deep need for accurate reporting and just middle of the road, nonpartisan reporting, because these people have more and more oxygen. Like they are very close to people who are running the Western world right now. And
Yep.
so, I'm not sure if we'll ever get, I'm not even espousing that we go back to the days of Walter Cronkite when like you had the choice of like 3 networks and, 2 newspapers or whatever. I mean, I see a lot of good things in the growth of the media and having all these different, voices out there that you can tune into, but it certainly has created an environment where there's a lot of disinformation, and it's really hard for people to sort through the weeds. But I think that, there are journalistic ethics out there. There's like the Society of Professional Journalists. They set the standards for the practices that journalists need to follow. I mean, it's not like, doctors taking an oath or lawyers, but it's kind of like our own version of that like these are the standards that if you're a professional journalist, you have to, abide by, and they will list the organizations, the news outlets that are considered legitimate. So if you are wondering like, I wonder what I can trust out there, go to a site like the Society for Professional Journalists, and you can look up which news organizations are members and are recognized and hold to those standards. So that's one way to cut through the noise.
And Gary here said to stay off social media, and I have to say that's just not gonna happen. And so I think it's back to the literacy, teaching our kids about internet literacy. And then the second thing, for journalists, it's our job to get into the trenches and push this stuff on those social media sites. We gotta do that, that's where they're getting the news, we meet them there.
I mean, with the collapse in advertising, which is what really brought this all about. It became the rise in tech fortunes, and the people who have really made money off this should be brought into the equation somehow, and they're not, because of a government failure in the Congress and locally the president. But the owners of Facebook, X, Instagram, TikTok, etc., all of the usual suspects, they have a tremendous financial resource at their command now, and the product they're selling is the audience. So they sell
right.
that audience. That audience is worth a tremendous amount of money to the society, and it's destructive.
Okay, let's take another question from here in the room. Yes, you in the brown.
Between corporate consolidation and the technology takeover, what would your advice be to aspiring young journalists who want to navigate the field or get into it earnestly and like be a real journalist and not just somebody with a podcast?
I got a content creator. I got so sad when it went from stories to content. It's just a personal thing, but anybody any advice from for aspiring journalists or somebody who wants to get into it?
Go with your local entity first, your small town local paper. I have an opening right now, by the way. And your day-to-day knowledge, you learn as you go on the street. You sit with your local editor and go, okay, this is really good, this is accurate, or why did you do this? Is this accurate? Did you talk to this person or did you talk to that person? So go with your small town local newspaper that covers the quilt winner at the Tanner Valley State Fair.
Don't need to battle Gary here, but also we're hiring some.
There are jobs out there.
And there's also, I was gonna say, there's also summer internships. I think, I'm not sure if we fund those or not, but I've seen that there are, paid summer internships, and that's a great way to kind of test the waters. You're not committing to like a long-term job, but you're kind of getting time and you're building a portfolio, and then that can often lead to your first entry-level job, so.
And even if you can't get paid, maybe you could get academic credit to work for a paper.
You absolutely can. I can say that as a member of the journalism department.
AI is a real threat to this, but if nothing else, it's a good way to learn how to write.
Yeah.
Although really, AI is an enormous threat.
We can't go down that
And
rabbit hole.
it will. Well,
It's a different program.
It's a different program, but it's gonna be really severe damage to remaining small institutions, I'm afraid.
All right, we're
I'll
gonna
shut up
take,
about that.
okay, we're gonna take another question off of Zoom. This is from Mike. How much self-censoring is going on with mainstream and national public US media? Anticipatory censoring with the threats to Canada's economy and sovereignty and NATO and EU countries. I've appreciated reporting perspectives from CBC Canada, BBC UK, DW Germany. So is there, our journalists, do you think there's anticipatory censoring going on?
Always
US
goes on. That
outlets?
is always
Yes.
something you do.
What's that?
It's always, that's forever, that has always been the case. And it depends on, it may be your owner, the owner of the institution you work for, your boss, or, you know, or just sort of your internal mechanism. You can't do everything you think that every dumb idea that comes into your head should not go.
Good point, Jeremy.
Sometimes, I don't always follow that.
Topic, preemptive self-censoring, I'd say that's exactly what happened with UAF, deleting diversity, equity, and inclusion from the websites.
Yeah. All right, another question here in the room. Sir, you.
Yeah, I went to the protest on Saturday, I guess it was, and then went
Were you
to
paid?
I went to the assembly, the borough assembly room, to the conference there, and I've been here. And it seems like mostly what we're doing is identifying lots of problems. We're talking about problems that exist. And borough assembly discussion was about partisanship. And I hear partisanship mentioned here a few times, that that's really the problem with journalism, is that people are reporting at the corners and it becomes disinformation. So my question is, what can we actually do to make a difference? Because if everybody in Alaska spent the next 4 years trying to change the electoral college, it probably wouldn't make a difference. If we all tried to impeach Trump, it probably wouldn't make a difference. What can we do in the state of Alaska to end partisanship? I mean, it seems to me like the problem is the Democratic and Republican parties we need to get rid of. That's what causes partisanship.
Well,
how can we do something about that?
You could get rid of them. The other thing you could do is have it so that close to a majority participate in the party, because they're very much a minority.
65% of the people in Alaska don't belong to either party.
Right, and that's part of the problem, is that the parties are controlled by minority groups. And I don't mean minority group in the normal sense. I mean minority in the sense of the population of Alaska, and that they're relatively small groups setting policy for the Republican Party of Alaska and the Democratic Party.
Why do we need the party?
So, just a couple of things. I think, call Senator Lisa Murkowski and thank her for not being on the partisan train all the time. She has had a lot of courage. Pete Hegseth, she voted against his nomination, and well, look at what happened with Signal anyway. But also on the tariffs issue, she and a few Republicans broke ranks and sided with the Democrats, saying that the tariffs are out of control and Congress should reclaim its authority. And the other thing I'd say is we have to keep ranked choice voting, because people like Senator Murkowski would not have gotten in had it not been for ranked choice voting. That is absolutely critical, and it almost lost. So make sure we got to keep that.
And I think that, you know, let's take it back a little bit and maybe Paula or Gary can answer this. from a journalism perspective, I think that one thing that we can do as a people, as a public, is support local journalism. I mean, you know, have a subscription to the News Miner. Make sure you read the Alaska Beacon, which is another nonprofit newsroom. Doing those kinds of things, that's what enables them, you know, Gary, to fill his vacant position. Anything else you guys would like to add?
Well, to touch on, you asked, Colin referenced internet, online literacy, media literacy is at a severe lack in this nation. People not being able to discern what's an opinion piece and what's a news story. Media literacy is, I think, of utmost importance.
And
For the public.
how are we ever gonna teach, how can you teach that? This is an enormous challenge, and adults don't have any.
I think
Well,
it
many of
starts,
them don't
I
have a
think it
clue.
starts at the elementary school level.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I really think, and there's curriculum out there for media literacy for kids.
And
Right,
even-
and what do you remove from the school day now to do that?
Well, for example, even at the college level, I bring my students to the library and one of the archivists gives a training and part of it includes how do you recognize sources that are legitimate? So, you know, we could all work on that.
How about another question? Yes, in the back.
Yeah, so I was wondering, I think there's a lot of discussion around funding for journalism and how that can potentially influence the stories that are published. I think there's a lot of criticism of like certain organizations funding certain institutions leading to skewed opinions. What would you say, regardless of medium, is the most ethical way to approach funding journalism?
Anybody want
I have a
to?
related question,
Or-
if I could get it later.
I mean, I've worked for small outlets and I worked for medium-sized outlets, and generally they were owned by a for-profit company, like McClatchy News used to own the Anchorage Daily News. When I worked at KTO in Juneau, that's public broadcasting, so it was member, you know, people who lived in the community donating, plus 10% came from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. So, I mean, there's different models out there, but I think that ones that are like subscriber based or donor based, you know, that's coming from the people. That's coming from people who care about that particular news outlet that values the coverage. You know, that's kind of, I'm not a business person, so I've never had to work on the business side of things, but I just know I've been through, you know, downsizing in this industry, like when I worked at the Daily News. When I left in 2006 to go to graduate school, that's when like the writing was on the wall. They weren't funding travel anymore. You couldn't buy like reporters' notebooks. You couldn't buy pens and stuff like that. And I went overseas to get my graduate degree. When I came back, there was no way I was going to go back because they were laying people off. Like, you know, they started with buyouts and then they went to layoffs, and it just was shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. And that was when it was owned by McClatchy, you know. And then when Alaska Dispatch bought it, when Alice Rogoff paid like $35 million for it, and when a couple of years it went into a tailspin and you know, was sold to the Binkleys. I mean, it's just, I think people are still experimenting with what is the right business model for this industry. I think people are still kind of wrapping their heads around that you have to actually pay for news. You know, like in the early days of the internet, you go to websites and everything was for free, you know, and then newspapers started realizing that they had to charge for it. So they put up paywalls. And a lot of people to this day, myself included, sometimes I really want to read that one article, but you can't because there's a paywall there. And I don't want to take out a full-time subscription. I just want to read that one article, you know, so it's challenging. And I don't know if any of others on the panel have a better answer, but that's
on the small scale market like we are, people just don't write a check and go, here's a donation. Now you have to cover the story this way. It's just not something that happens like on your grand, big, multi-million-dollar corporation levels. I'm skeptic that I am. I'm hesitant to say what's happening. At KUAC, News Miner, you know, that's not the reality. The reality is we're funded by your neighbors and your friends and yourselves and people who are like, want to know what's going on at city council or the school board meeting because the Washington Post is not covering that. You know,
unfortunately. Jeremy, you looked like you were, or no?
I was trying to have an idea. I didn't-
Okay. Me too. All right, let's take another question. Way in the back, sir.
So, actually, I really like you guys quite a bit. I intended to write about why the first family was so good when I was in high school. And I got to go to a seat of 5 people that were all AP reporters. And they told me all about doing reporting for all around the world and stuff like that. It was just absolutely amazing. But the thing is like, I really love that. But the thing is what I'm really asking though, if you have these things that are not believed, can you write history where people cannot deny? And things of that nature. And well, and like, here's an odd example for you. But yeah, you have the president before FDR. And the thing is he really was seemingly a good president and everything like that, but then he created the Great Depression. Then he did things that President Trump is doing right now. So that's my point being made is just, could you actually just report that and say, this is what occurred when this president did this with our economy? And that's my degrees in history, so that's the reason I use that as an example.
It always used to be said that newspapers were the first draft of history.
And I think that point has been made in various sources in recent, in the past few months about how the tariffs helped trigger the Great Depression. And people have written that, but there's such an enormous flood of information and disinformation that it was much easier. It was much easier when there was a much more limited universe of publications and broadcasting outlets. You know, then you can really say, oh yeah, that's been reported or that hasn't been reported. Now, you know, now it's sort of like a Google search. Almost everything has been reported somewhere.
So you're basically, because of that situation, you're out of luck as far as running on the street for reasons to do something.
Yeah, because you can probably, yes, I think you are, maybe. I don't know. I don't know.
Anybody have a more optimistic answer than that?
I'm sorry.
That's fair enough. I'm gonna take another Zoom question from a previous journalism student, David Leslie. Good to hear from you. How can local journalists set guidelines to prevent future censorship or to at least let consumers know that they are compromised? We can give you like do you want me to repeat it?
Can you just rephrase it?
How can local journalists, I guess, prevent censorship or, you know, are you being censored? Is there any way to censor local journalism other than by not subscribing to local journalism?
I've never experienced censorship.
Just fact checking is really important. And when Meta says we're no longer gonna fact check, that's a problem. You know, anyway, but I'm not a journalist. You guys answer it.
Well, that was an enormous cop out for Zuckerberg's.
Sellout is more accurate, so.
And his financial interest. I think maybe the answer to that question from David might be, you know, being organizations being more aggressive and candid about what their rules are. I mean, nobody knows, the readers of the Newsminer don't know what the rules are about this in the Newsminer.
But what rules though? Is this?
Yeah, that
It
was trying.
sounds me that we're considered like some secret cabal of.
No, Gary, no, I'm not, that's just.
Y'all not know me, you know.
Right, people don't know that.
I know
People don't know that. That you.
I'm chucklehead, I'm on social media.
What's that, Brian?
You would censor,
Profanity.
I mean, it'd be easy to lay out what your standards are in terms of what you're gonna allow in the picture.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, if it's H dash dash dash. Which used to be the Newsminer standard.
HE dash dash dash.
Let's take another question from here in the room. Ma'am, you and the Arcteryx.
I don't mean to beat a dead horse because we keep coming back to it, but I think we keep coming back to it because it's the root. and the root is media literacy.
Yes.
And so, Art made a really good point about partisanship. What can we do in Alaska about it? It was mentioned that there could be, as early as a grade school curriculum. Dermot was like, how are we ever gonna teach it? Now we're saying, well, it could be easy for the newsminer to just list things. You don't know what you don't know. I'm terrified that all these young people are thinking that TikTok is news. I think it needs to be like a general statement of every relevant news source that they say, this is how we demonstrate our commitment to integrity in our journalism. We do this, this, and this. We don't do this, and this, and this. And if you don't see this stated by your news source, it's not news. I know that's a statement, not a question, but like, I guess my question would be, why can't every journalism outlet adopt that code right now that is relevant and legitimate?
I think it's an excellent statement. I think I completely agree with you. And I think it would be great if Facebook, among others, had put a statement. We will publish basically anything here.
Yeah.
Whether or not it's true, as long as, I don't know what the standards are to get something removed. I don't know what they are, but there's probably some. But an admission like that would be pretty damning.
I think it's interesting to think about putting that in a place where everyone would read it and not be the fine print, because no one reads the fine print, and how are you gonna get that message across?
That's right. Or that's the first thing you see on your website.
I've been ignoring this side of the room. I feel a little bit bad about that. So yes, simple.
This might be a simple question for the lawyer. How is federal funding of news media like NPR and PBS not incongruent with the First Amendment? It's a simple thing. It causes friction with my wife, how simple I am. I don't get it.
You're asking why is it?
How is federal funding not incongruent with the First Amendment? How is giving them money to make the news?
I can answer. I mean, basically, when the Corporation for Public Broadcasting gives NPR and PBS the money, they don't say, with this money, you must write this news story, or you must write it with this slant. It's given to the outlets, and then they use it under their own editorial discretion.
And
It's only about 10%. Most of the public radio stations and TV stations, their budget is only about 10% federal. So
But
it's not
still
a big.
10%, you have 10% of your reporters, that's significant. I would say it actually supports the First Amendment, it's not incongruent with it, because it allows for the media to exist without being beholden to companies and advertisements. And that's fundamental to the free press.
And that may play into this statement position regarding what your standards are. And because, PBS and NPR do have standards that they at least try to adhere to. Personally, I think it might be good for PBS and NPR to get away from federal funding. I do think in Alaska, however, is a unique circumstance, and it certainly deserves state support because of the number of rural communities that have no commercial enterprises, no commercial, communications facility, cable TV for, the Real Housewives of wherever. And so in Alaska, it performs a particularly important function.
Right.
But it would also be good to get, because of the stigma created by the Republican Party regarding, claiming that it's Marxist, which is certainly not. Anyway, I'm not sure if that's exactly a really coherent argument there. But I think it'd be better to do without federal support. But here, state support is really good for public broadcasting. And I might add, Ted Stevens was one of the major public radio and TV supporters in the Congress for many, many years. In part because he knew how important it was in the past.
And the proof that that 10% of funding does not mean that they're controlling NPR and PBS. It's the fact that the Trump administration is trying to do away with it. So clearly, it's not in they think it's not in their interest to have NPR and PBS. And it's, I think it very much is in the public interest.
And the threats of public radio, I mean, that's been going on for years. Like in the mid-90s, I was working down in Juneau at KTOO. And even then, like, that was a big topic of discussion that they wanted to eliminate all federal funding for public radio. The thing is that in a lot of states, there's bipartisan support for it because a lot of places have lots of rural communities where, like Dermot said, public radio is like the only news source. And so when there's a natural disaster, or pandemic, or the stock market is crumbling, oftentimes the only way you're going to find out about it is turning on a public radio station. So a lot of people on both sides of the aisle actually support it. That's why they haven't been able to get rid of it.
But do call your Congress people because it is on the chopping block.
I'm a village kid. I grew up on it. I'm still cloudy how federal funding isn't respectful of that media outlet.
Because it's filtered through an entity that is supposed to insulate it from this.
And
That-
does, I mean, they're critical of administrations, whoever they are. So I don't think they're owned by the government just because of.
But one thing along those lines that is kind of interesting is, Voice of America. It's been around from, I think, World War II, like fully US government funded, supposed to be a voice for democracy in all over the world, especially in places where, there's dictatorships and stuff like that. That was just done away with, like
That was a couple weeks ago.
Yeah.
So, we probably have time for just a couple more questions.
Yeah, sure. I just wanted you to address both sidism. And I work on climate change, education, and we see this all the time. The media will say this side and this side. Well, there aren't really two sides. The scientists at this university and elsewhere, 97, 98%, there's one side. So that's one issue. And then somebody asked me said to me one time, both sides do it with gerrymandering. So I researched it. I looked at the 12 most populous states, and only one state was gerrymandered by, you can guess which party. 3 have an independent commission, and then the other party gerrymandered the other. So I've seen this in the media a lot, and I just wanted you to, media folks, to talk about that.
Well, and let me just add to this. This is a question that's related that came in from Zoom, which is, do media outlets prioritize neutrality over accuracy, which is that sort of both sidesism, for fear of appearing partisan? And how do you negotiate that?
I mean, to me, accuracy is always the top priority in journalism, because if you get it wrong, you're gonna have egg all over your face. You're gonna have people calling your radio station or writing to you complaining. People are very active readers and very active listeners. And if you make any mistake, they'll go for the jugular. So you have to be extremely careful about any word that you put out there or any script that you air on the radio. So personally, I think, and the journalists I know, I think would agree with me that accuracy is like the top priority. As far as your question about the both sidisms kind of thing, I mean, and when it comes to climate change, I will say that, like, in the early days when we started covering climate change, there was a tendency to do that. Well, these scientists say that climate change is happening, but these people say it isn't. And it was, you would try to like give equal time to both sides. But as the science progressed and it became less controversial to accept the notion that releasing greenhouse gases into the atmosphere causes climate change, I think you see less of that in the news these days. At least, I certainly saw my own reporting advance to the point where I wasn't giving equal time to the skeptics. So.
Yeah.
I'll also just give a little political science perspective. I remember watching a video that was by the New York Times on a book on fascism. And it said that one of the indicia of fascism is that truth is really, there isn't a truth. It's all relative. And this is very dangerous because there really are truths. Climate change is one of them. Measles vaccines is another one. I've been happy to see that RFK now thinks that measles vaccines are a good thing after he went to the funeral of the 8-year-old who died needlessly of measles. But this is something to really be aware of. Their science is fact and climate change is a fact and it's not all relative. And when we talk like that, we undermine truth and that's dangerous.
And it is neutrality. I mean, sometimes it's a mark of a not very good reporter.
Yeah, it's lazy reporting.
Like for instance, if you do a story on Hitler. So, here's something good about Hitler and here's something bad about it.
Okay, and actually, on that note, I just want to read this one quote. So there's a guy named Marvin Kalb. He's a longtime respected journalist and then became a professor at Harvard. And he's written many books. He came out with a book in 2018 called The Enemy of the People, Trump's War on the Press and the Threat to American Democracy. So this was written 7 years ago, okay? I'm just going to read a little excerpt of it because I think it kind of speaks to what we're talking about to some extent right now. This is according to Cal. Attacks on the media had been the hallmark of Trump's presidential campaign, but this charge marked a dramatic turning point. Language like this ventured into dangerous territory. 20th century dictators, notably Stalin, Hitler, and Mao, had all denounced their critics, especially the press, as enemies of the people. Their goal was to delegitimize the work of the press as fake news and create confusion in the public mind about what's real and what isn't, what can be trusted and what can't. That, it seems, is also Trump's goal. That was written 7 years ago. Just think about how this has ramped up like since then. So, it's dangerous waters that we're navigating right now. Very dangerous.
And
Can
I
I do
think
this at you guys? Is that I watched my mom get sucked into fully Fox News. Talk about the nonsense that comes like, what? How did that happen? How did we let that happen in this country?
well, that's actually related to this question, that we got from Zoom from another former student. Hi, LaToya, and who says, what else can journalists do to improve our public perception of the media with the fake news attacks?
Well, I will say in a history now, in journalism history, Roger Ailes, many people don't know this, Roger Ailes was in the Nixon administration and he did not like what he saw happen when he was working in the White House, and he set out to correct it and he won his battle.
Wow. We lost a generation to this news show.
So back to the question, besides fact checking, what can journalists do to improve their public perception in the face of attacks? This is fake news. This is fake news.
I think we hold forums like this, I mean, we talk to the public. A lot of newsrooms these days are having what we call pop-up newsrooms. Like we did this in this Honolulu Civil Beat where I used to work at. We'd go out into the community and set up in a library for a day and just like take our computers and work. But we'd invite people to come in and give us story ideas or give us feedback on our coverage. And it was very kind of locally driven and it made for some like really good stories. And it just informed us, about how well we were doing or not, connecting with our readers. And one thing positive I do see about the news industry is we are engaging more with the public. It used to be like when I would write news stories for the newspaper, we didn't really care what people thought about it. I mean, we wanted it to be good journalism and stuff like that. But if we got a reader comment, on the phone or an email, be like, whatever. And usually there were complaints because it wasn't seen as a two-way street, and I feel like now the public does feel more able to like contact reporters have like their own social media accounts, or they invite people to comment, to direct message them or whatever. So in some ways it's becoming more democratized. And I think it's taken a lot of journalists, time to kind of adapt to that. Because it used to be that I would like to hear from the readers, but like, not really, I mean, like when they call in, like you made a mistake, it's like, okay, I gotta correct that. But like as time has evolved, we're seeing it more as like this mutual relationship. Like we rely on you to give us tips and to give us feedback and to whatever,
Subscriptions.
And yeah, so I don't know. I'm encouraged by that. So
I think that young reporters and editors have to keep experimenting and try to improve that aspect.
Yes, ma'am.
As somebody who gets most of my news from KUAC, KRFF, KWR, KLP, low power, all volunteer and donated, and the Fairbanks Daily News Miner, I'm very concerned about interference in the radio waves and monopolization of the radio waves. You know, most people who listen to radio apparently mostly listen when they're driving their car. It's not gonna die. It is a very good form of communication. And what happens is that you get a low power station and somebody who doesn't like the news on that low power station gets a commercial license and a very close bandwidth and then makes interference so you can't hear the station you're trying to listen to. What can you guys tell us about how we can affect the Federal Communication Commission, if it hasn't been wiped out yet, to protect the free speech in the radio waves and not have them taken over by big money, deep pocket?
Contact your congressional delegation.
Yeah.
That's the most direct thing that you can do.
Yeah. We probably have time for about one more question. Yes,
There's
ma'am.
a student over here who's gonna.
Okay, well, all right,
Okay,
fine,
two
we
more
have two more questions.
You gotta go home.
It's just a quick comment. I was thinking, I'm trying to think of one positive thing right now. And that is I've really enjoyed the News Miner and the letters to the editors and the opinion pieces. It has been very, very active. And I think that's been a really.
You have no idea how.
More active than you can possibly imagine is what we get.
For community perspectives and letters to the editor in my inbox, and I had space to print and one day.
It's been an interesting read.
And we encourage them, you know, send them in. I will give you guidelines if you need guidelines on what we do accept and don't accept, but it's been very active the past couple of months. Yeah.
Lynn, I just want to throw something before, but another thing that happened today. This is reported tonight. The Alaska Humanities Forum was informed that their grant was being terminated. Quote, your grant's immediate termination is necessary to safeguard the interests of the federal government, including its fiscal priority. Termination of your grant represents an urgent priority for the administration, and due to exceptional circumstances, adherence to the traditional notification process. That's a letter to the Alaska Humanities Forum from the National Endowment.
How much money was that?
I don't know, but it's a key part of the Alaska Humanities. It's the main source of funding for Alaska Humanities Forum, which has a lot of different programs. These things shouldn't be being eliminated, but this is going without much notice and without public discussion.
Well, while we're praising media, I'd also just say the Sun Star has been doing some excellent coverage on the DEI issue. They broke stories that weren't broken other places, so. Well,
All right, and now what's really gonna be our last question?
So my main question is, I feel like this question will help a lot for people in my generation specifically. So I consider myself an independent. So I'm not on the liberal side, I'm not on the Republican side, I'm a little bit in the middle. What kind of news sources would you say is good to use? Because there are a lot of Republican ones, like I've heard people today have comments on Fox. However, my father watches Fox as a Republican, so that's what I'm used to in my household. I want some sort of news source that is not on the liberal side, but not on the Republican side. It can give me a neutral perspective of everything
I
going
got
on.
it. Associated Press.
Associated Press?
Yep, the one that just won the lawsuit today.
Do they have like a TV station?
They have an app.
They have an app. Yeah, and they are in, news sites and papers. You are a member of AP, right?
We've since left the AP.
Oh, you said, I mean, the AP is a cooperative, so they have participants from all over the country, all over the world who pool their resources along with the AP also employs its own reporters. So it's sort of the biggest repository for news from everywhere I think that there is.
Yeah.
A
So
little dry. I think,
And that's for American news, but like BBC is also a good one.
The Alaska Beacon is an interesting.
Yes.
also run by a nonprofit. We're running out of time here, so I'm gonna just give each of you sort of if you've got a parting shot, a short one. Now is the time. Dermot?
Thank you for coming.
Keep active, call your Congress people, let them know you're there. Don't tune out of the news, and thank you to the journalists who are unsung heroes.
Local media, whether it's a student paper, KUAC, the local newspaper, your fake news has an incredible trickle down effect. You know, we're not fake news, we're covering Fairbanks City Council.
Buy your local newspaper, and if you got students, if you got friends, children who go to UAF, we are hiring. We'd love to develop a new generation of journalists.
And I would dovetail off of that, you know, I'm new to this faculty position, but I'm trying to also recruit the next generation of journalists. And, you know, a lot of people don't want to go into it anymore because it's low pay, it's high stress. But I can't think of a more important time to be a journalist.
It's also like the best job ever.
It's the most fun job you ever have. Like I've mostly been a journalist, but at times I've have worked in public relations when my children were young and stuff. And I was always like, I have to go back to journalism, you know, and so it's a great profession. And you know, and you don't even have to do it full time. You know, you can freelance, right? You can keep your regular day job and be a freelancer. And for people who aren't interested in being journalists, you can also write letters to the editor, like Gary was just saying, or guest commentaries. There's lots of ways to get your voice out there in a rational way, not being a keyboard warrior, like reacting to things on social media, but really like think pieces, like use your mind and really formulate an argument. We're all here to help you if you need tips, you know, or whatever, but just stay active and please believe in the profession. It's not like we're all hucksters and, you know, fake news people. Like we really believe in our democracy and we really want to continue keeping it strong. So that's all I have to say.
And like a democracy requires an informed electorate.
Right.
There's no better way than to stay informed than to consume all kinds of media. So with that, thank you very much to our panelists and thank you to you for coming.